My name is Vincent Crowley. I grew up on a farm outside of Fulda. I had to volunteer for the draft and go through the draft cycle to get into the Army, and then I took a test IQ test, and I qualified for the Air Force, and I volunteered for the Air Force. And you had to volunteer to fly, and then you had to see a psychiatrist to see if you were wanting to commit suicide. So it was very, there was more casualties in the flying units of the Army, Navy, and than there was in all the other units put together. I was 20 years old when I went into service, and I went through basic training and went immediately to Las Vegas to gunnery training, which took 6 weeks. And then I graduated from gunnery training, got the wings, and I got a 10-day furlough, and it took 3 days to get home. And I had 3 days at home, and that was the end of the furlough. So I had to go to Tampa, Florida for phase training, and we went from Tampa, Florida to Drew Field and started flying with the crew. We flew all around in the United States, getting acquainted with the equipment and the crew. And then we went to Savannah, Georgia, and picked up a new airplane, and we started the trip overseas, and the orders weren't opened until we got over the Atlantic. We went to Bangor, Maine, and then we went to Newfoundland, then we went to Iceland, Greenland, and our destination was Valley Wales. Well, we left the plane, and then they got it combat ready. We were in B-17s. We were in B-17Gs. There were several different ratings of B-17. The ones that we flew in were G. We enlisted in the Air Force to be pilots and navigators and bombardiers, but at that time they were losing so many gunners, and then they just cut it all off. Everybody was a gunner from that day on until they needed more officers, because there was 6 gunners that were on the plane, and there was 3 officers. So every time a plane went down, there was 6 gunners. So they needed to replenish the gunners. We landed at Valley Wales, and then we got on a train and went to Thorpe Abbotts. It's on the northern part of England, and it was the Hunters Bomber Group, and we flew. I flew 33 missions over Germany. The rest of the crews who flew 35, I was in the hospital when they flew 2 missions, and when they finished their 35, they said I had finished 2 with them, so I didn't have to fly the other 2 missions. We had people that refused to fly, and they had told us the punishment for refusing to fly after you had volunteered and signed up for it was they would give you an M1 rifle and send you over to the front lines. So that was a threat, but most of the guys ended up working at the base, and one of the guys that refused to fly, he woke us up in the morning, and he would come in and he'd start hollering and get up, and you're a bunch of cannon fodder and a whole bunch of insults, and then about that time, Axis Sally was the main spy for Germany. She would get on the British broadcasting, and she could override British broadcasting, and then she would tell us, you guys in the Hunters Bomb Group better take a good look at your wife's picture or your girlfriend's picture, because you're not going to make it back. We're waiting for you. And then she would tell us where we were going, and it was supposed to be top secret. And then when we'd get down to briefing, they'd have 3 curtains. They'd open each curtain, and the big curtain opened up that showed where we were going to go. And Axis Sally had already told us 3 o'clock in the morning. So they had pretty good espionage. We would have to go and get our equipment, which was flak jacket, helmet, boots for high altitude flying, and our oxygen equipment, mask. And then we put that in a big bag, and we would go out and wait for a Jeep to come along, and then we'd jump on that Jeep and get a ride out to the heart stand where the plane was parked. And then we put our equipment in the plane, and we usually tried to take off just as the sun was coming up in the morning. So we had already been up 3 hours. So we had short runs into, like, we bombed Cologne a couple times, and Cologne was we called it a milk run because it was close by. It was about 5 hours flying time before we got back to the base. But then when we had to go to Hamburg, which was a lot further up, and that was a 9-hour trip. And then when we went to Berlin, it was 10 hours in flight time. And when we flew over Berlin, there was 1,000 bombers had bombed Berlin that day, and the pilot misunderstood in the briefing, and instead of turning to the right, he turned to the left, and we flew right into the other squadrons that were coming. And I don't know how we made it through there, but we squeezed through there, and then we had to fly all the way back across Germany, one lone one lone 17, and they never sent any fighters up to shoot us down. So, but we had to go to the anti-aircraft guns had corridors where they had these, and that showed on our maps where there was corridors were. So we'd have to fly up and down to find a place to cross. If you come to a lake, it was safe to cross there because anti-aircraft guns weren't out there. You were really isolated, and it was small. You had to crawl back on your hands and knees, and you had to have your parachute and your flight jacket with you, your flak jacket with you, and drag it back on a catwalk. And there was just room for your shoulders in there. And then there was a foot of armor plate right in front of you. And then there was a canopy over the top of it. Well, we had our intercom, and we'd talk back and forth on the intercom. During the flight run where you were going to drop the bombs on the bomb run, it was absolutely no intercom, but they knew I was Catholic, and it was real quiet in the plane, and then somebody would peek up and say, "Crowley, you got your rosary with you?" So they, yes, no atheists in the airplane, so. We were shot up pretty bad, and the co-pilot was talking to the pilot, and he said, "Let's ditch it in the channel." And the pilot said, "Well, we can't do that. That damn Crowley will drown." I never did learn how to swim, so at least we didn't ditch it in the channel. Well, we had to go for debriefing, and in order to get the guys to talk quite freely, they gave us a water glass full of scotch. So you loosened up the tongues pretty good, and sometimes the stories got a little carried away, but we had a chaplain that was an Irishman, and he'd say, "Well, my two Irish buddies better have a second glass," and we could just tumble back to the mess hall and get something to eat by that time. So our mission it was our 7th mission, and we went to Hamburg, Germany, and it was a submarine plant, and the idea of the raid was to go in and bounce the bombs into this submarine plant. And we were right over the North Sea, and we turned to get, after dropping the bombs, we turned into headwind, 100 miles an hour, and we were just standing there and weren't making no headway. And then the Germans came up with ME-09s, and we couldn't move fast enough to get out of the way. And there was 12 B-17s from our squadron of 36 12 of those planes were shot down, and they went down into the North Sea, and the waves were higher than this building. So they never had a chance of getting out at all. And then there was 130 of our friends that went down, and then our radio man was killed in our plane, and out of our barracks there was 4 different planes that they flew on, and out of our barracks of 24 people, there was 19 of them killed that day. So it was one of the worst air battles in air history. After this mission over Hamburg, when so many planes are down, everybody at the base just was upset, and they called an ambulance to take me to the hospital. And then there was another guy that had got shot in the back of the head, and the drivers were all excited and getting this to the hospital as quick as possible. And they put us both facing the same way, and they were going as fast as they could go with the ambulance like you got sitting down here. And they come to a dead end, and they went right through and out into a pasture and run into a tree. And then we were strapped down in there, but the guy on top, all of his bandages and everything fell down on my face. And I had my hands tied down, so I couldn't get it away. So when we got to the hospital, they took me out first, and they said, "This guy don't look very good." And then they brought the other guy out, and he said, "He's dead." Wheeled him out behind. And they had given me so much morphine that I couldn't talk, and I could hear him talking. And my gosh, I said, I hope they don't send me out back there. So, but then we were in the hospital I was in there for 10 days, and then the ammunition dump got exploded some way, and all the bombs went off. And we had to jump out of bed and get underneath the bed because we thought it was an air raid. And everybody, because if you could get out of bed, you got underneath it. That was it. I had a bunch of tin in my shoulder, and they cut it out, and then they packed it with sulfa. Sulfa was new then. They packed it with sulfa and left that in there for 10 days, and then they sewed it together. And I went back to our base. The Bloody 100th, they called it the Bloody 100th, and there was 177 airplanes shot down from the 100th bomb group, which amounted to a lot of people. And the way they got that reputation, earlier in the war, they were if you surrendered to the Germans and put your flaps down and agreed to land. And this company, this plane, put the flaps down and went down the runway, and there was 2 German fighters escorting them. And when they got just about to the ground, they opened fire and shot down these 2 German aircraft, and then they took off and went back. And that's what started they always went after the 100th bomb group. So the mission over Berlin, we talked about it before, but 1,000 bombers had bombed Berlin that day, and they used a lot of fire bombs. And when we turned we turned the wrong way, and we turned right into the other squadrons, and we were looking right down over Berlin, and it looked like the whole city was on fire. So I said I seen hell from up there, and it looked like we could be going down into it because we were evading every other plane to try and get past. Well, we were the only plane flying, and all the rest of the squadrons had gone the other way around, and we had to find our way across Germany and try to avoid the flak places. The flak was 20 millimeter shots that they set up in the air, and they were set to explode at a certain altitude. And if they got your altitude, they could really get you bad. They exploded and they poked holes in the gas tanks. And it's very dangerous. But they had a little trouble getting the right altitude all the time. So we had to avoid all of those places that we could. And I think I mentioned before that we'd go along, and if we'd see a lake, you knew it was safe to go across there because there was no anti-aircraft guns out there. There's a story that goes with this. Leonard Pipgrass was killed in action, and it was both our birthdays that day, and in the morning in briefing, he was just kidding around. He said, "I don't think you'll make it back," and I didn't even answer him. I didn't, tongue-tied, and somebody else shot down on ME 109 and it rolled over our plane, and he was flying next to us in a B-17, and it hit that B-17 and they both exploded, and there was no survivors and there were no parachutes. It was just a whole lot of pieces. And it was close enough to our plane that it blistered the plexiglass on the windows. So it was, we lucked out that it went over the top of our plane. So that is Leonard Pipgrass, and he lived about 2 miles from our place back in the United States. That was a sad deal. But then there was James Jepson, Norbert DePaul, he was a POW. Jack Larson, POW. Matt Metz, POW. Harold Geisler, POW. Franklin Scully, POW. Vince Crowley got by lucky. I didn't end up a POW. These guys were all from Murray County, a county of 9,000 people. And I'm the only survivor, and that is why I'm doing this interview, because I want their names mentioned as a tribute to them, because they had it much worse than I did, especially the POWs. Harold Giesler, the boys, his boys and our boys, okay, were practicing riding horses, and he brought them over to our place, and then they went to school the next day, and they said, we didn't get much sleep last night because their dad and Vince Crowley were talking them over. I was staff sergeant. It's not the highest rank in the Army, but it paid better than some of the others. So, and we got $50 a month extra for flight pay because of the dangers. Well, I enlisted in December of 1943, and I got out in October of 1945. Yeah, I went home, and then I went we picked corn that fall, and then I went to junior college until February when a guy come in the store. I was working in the store for 25 cents an hour and going to school, and this guy come in the store and he said, "You want a farm?" And I said, "I ain't got anything to farm." He said, "I'm going to buy you a farm." So he bought a farm, and then I rented the farm, and I went out farming in February, and then I went back in May and took the test, and I got credit for the full year. I'm pilot and the ball turret gunner went, and they brought me this cap, and they came to see me. And there was one of my good buddies, and his daughter married a guy from the University of Minnesota, and so he was in Minnesota, and he thought he'd just drive down, and then he brought his family along, and we had some friends that had a trailer out at the lake, so we had them stay out at the lake, and they really enjoyed it. They thought that was as close to heaven as they could get. And then the pilot lived in Nebraska, and Hofer lived out in Tacoma, Washington. And then he had an old pickup and a camper, and he came out to see me, and then came, and his wife came up from Nebraska. So we had a pretty good reunion. I hope they never have to go to war, and I think discipline is the main thing in the Army. If you don't have discipline, you don't have an Army. So they have to get used to discipline if they're going to go into the service. Whatever they wish to do in life is to do a good job of it. And I was down to Sioux Falls, and they had a B-17 there, and this little guy, about 7 years old, was following us all around, and we were going through the B-17. And then when we were going back to the terminal, why his mother caught up to me and said he had bought a picture of the B-17 and he wanted me to autograph it. That was a big honor. I thought it was a great honor.